Good afternoon, colleagues. And before I begin, as usual, can I just remind members just to be careful about observing social distancing guidance when we're in the chamber and also throughout the building, but particularly when we're coming in and out of the chamber. We're going to turn in a second to First Minister's questions, but before we do, I wonder if I can ask the First Minister to introduce First Minister's questions with a short statement.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. I'll give a very brief statistical update. Since yesterday, an additional 21 cases of COVID-19 have been confirmed, which takes the total number now to 18,066. A total of 965 patients are currently in hospital with suspected or confirmed COVID-19, which is a decrease of 21 since yesterday, and that includes a decrease in the number of confirmed cases of 14. As of last night, 24 people were in intensive care with confirmed or suspected COVID-19, which is an increase of 5 since the number I reported yesterday. But let me stress that increase is all in suspected cases. Unfortunately, in the past 24 hours, 9 deaths of patients who had been confirmed as having the virus have been registered, and that takes the total number of deaths in Scotland under that measurement to 2,462. National Records of Scotland has also just published its more detailed weekly report. Those figures report deaths where COVID has been confirmed by a lab test and also cases where the virus was entered on a death certificate as a suspected or contributory cause of death. The latest NRS report covers the period to Sunday the 14th of June, and at that point, according to our daily figures, 2,448 deaths of people who had tested positive for the virus had been registered. Today's report shows, though, that by Sunday, the total number of registered deaths with either a confirmed or presumed link to the virus was 4,070. Of those, 70 were registered in the 7 days up to Sunday, and that is a decrease of 19 from the week before. Indeed, this is the 7th week in a row in which the number of deaths from the virus has fallen. The total number of excess deaths, which is the number above the 5-year average for the same time of year, also decreased again to 32 in the most recent week. Deaths in care homes made up 50% of all deaths linked to the virus last week. However, the number of COVID-19 deaths in care homes reduced again from 42 to 35. Now, all of these figures are still higher than I would ever wish them to be, and I do know that downward trends will never console those who've lost loved ones, and my thoughts and sympathies continue to be with all of them. However, as I said, the weekly number of COVID deaths has now fallen for 7 weeks in a row, and they are now at less than a ninth of their peak level. Excess deaths and care home deaths also continue to fall. Tomorrow, I expect to be able to confirm that we can move from phase 1 to phase 2 of our plan to emerge from lockdown, and I will set out much more detail of that tomorrow. However, we will continue to proceed in a cautious and phased way, because the more we hammer down this virus now, the more normality we can ultimately get back in all aspects of our life. Our Test and Protect system is, of course, vitally important to our plans to emerge safely from lockdown. Health Protection Scotland has just published further data on that system, and it shows that since 28th of May up until last Sunday, 992 cases were reported in which the individual tested positive. Contact tracing has already been completed for 891 of those and is ongoing in others. In total, 1,239 contacts have been traced so far. And I would remind everyone watching that if you have symptoms of COVID-19, you should book a test immediately and follow the advice on self-isolation. And I'll end by asking everyone again to continue to adhere to all of the elements of public health guidance and advice. It is making a difference, as these statistics demonstrate, and I thank everybody across the country for continuing to do the right thing.
Thank you very much, First Minister. We're going to turn now to questions. Question number 1 from Jackson Carlo.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I again welcome the sustained, though still obviously distressing, fall in the number of fatalities from COVID-19. Our thoughts are with those families, but that sustained fall is indeed, as I say, welcome. Presiding Officer, Professor Sridhar, one of the First Minister's key advisers on coronavirus, says that so long as COVID-19 cases are low enough come the middle of August, then schools should reopen as normally as possible with children back full-time. Does the First Minister agree with her analysis, and will she put in place a plan to deliver it?
First Minister.
Yes, I do agree wholeheartedly with Professor Sridhar's analysis. Can I say as an aside, Presiding Officer, that I deprecate anyone who is casting aspersions on the integrity of DB Sridhar this morning. But I agree with her in the totality of what she says, not just the bits of her analysis that suit my particular argument. I want to get schools back to normal as quickly as possible. I want to get our economy back to normal as quickly as possible. But I also know that all of that has to be safe. We cannot have memories so short that we already forget that we are dealing with a virus that is dangerous and potentially deadly, and it has not gone away. So we must continue to move forward in a careful and phased way, and that's what I will continue to do, because the key part of what Professor Schroeder and other experts will say is that we must suppress this virus even further if we are to have that ultimate and hopefully speedy move back to normality. So I would ask people to bear in mind the totality of her advice when tomorrow I stand up here and, yes, announce further steps out of lockdown, but continue to do that in a very careful and cautious manner.
Jackson Carlo.
Presiding officer, we all understand the difficulty here, and it's not enough just simply to deprecate all those who ask questions, whether they're politicians or journalists, when they do. And I believe what many parents are looking for is a commitment from ministers to at least try to get schools back as normal for the beginning of term. What's disappointing to those parents is that doesn't actually seem to be the ambition being set. As many parents have put it, if we can build a new hospital to look after patients, as we did so magnificently, surely we can find equally drastic solutions to support our children as well. Professor Schroeder's point is that a community-based testing regime, which helped us see exactly where the disease was spreading, would clearly give teachers and parents reassurance that schools were safe to return to normal. So the question is obvious, and it brings us back to the testing issue we've raised for several months. Will the First Minister today commit to ramping up our testing capacity and, importantly, our usage of that capacity during the summer, so that by August, opening schools full-time is a realistic and achievable option if safe to do so?
First Minister.
Just for the record, Presiding Officer, I do not deprecate anybody who asks questions. I deprecate people who cast aspersions on the integrity of an expert. And I think it's really important to be clear about that. I have given a commitment. I will do so again today. I will move heaven and earth with my ministerial colleagues to get this country in every aspect of our lives back to normal as quickly as possible. And nothing is more important in all of that than getting our children's education back to normal, and of course making sure we put plans in place to allow children to catch up on missed education. I take that responsibility very, very seriously indeed. But I also take my responsibility seriously to make sure that we get through this crisis as safely as possible. We have two strands in education in place right now. Firstly, in common with England, Wales and Northern Ireland, we're having to contingency plan to bring schools back with physical distancing in place, because that's what the evidence tells us right now is required. And within that, of course, our challenge is to maximise the time that children can spend in schools, which is why we're scrutinising Council's plans so carefully. But the second strand of that is to consider and to take advice on the alternative measures that we might be able to put in place to allow schools to operate safely as normal. That involves continuing to suppress the virus, and it also involves having in place a robust and reliable test and protect system, which is exactly what we have put in place, and over the weeks to come will be assuring ourselves is working as robustly as it needs to do. So what I would say to parents watching, who are the most important people of all, next of course to young people, is that that has my total commitment. But what I would say to people across this chamber, and do so sincerely, anybody in this chamber suggesting that these issues are simple are perhaps showing that they're not interested in sufficiently understanding them. We must proceed cautiously and carefully, and we must do nothing that compromises the safety of our young people, but the safety of the country overall. And I will continue to operate each and every single day in a way that doesn't focus on the politics of these issues, but simply focuses on my responsibility to get the country through this crisis as safely as I possibly can.
Jackson Carlo.
Presiding officer, France, Germany, Denmark and Ireland are moving heaven and earth. This government is not. And if alternatives have to be found, let's turn to them. If it does not prove possible to open schools fully in August, then the government needs to be far more creative than it has been so far. It needs to start with an open mind and be open to radical proposals. And parents are now suggesting them. We need the government to be open to these ideas as well. To take two, will the Scottish Government to commit to contact all newly qualified teachers and supply teachers to boost teacher numbers? And will it intervene where any council may now seek to reduce teacher numbers or cancel probationary teacher opportunities? And secondly, will the government state clearly today that they will support local councils with the additional funding they require so that buildings, public and private, can be made available where children could spend some of the week being taught?
First Minister.
Can I address all of those issues directly, but can I take on the point about other countries, because actually that's an important point, and one of the things we will be doing, as we have been doing, is looking to learn from other countries. Our International Council of Education Advisors has got a critical role to play in that, of course, as does the advisory group on COVID-19. But some of the, Jackson Carlaw quoted a number of countries, and actually in many of these countries, if not all of them, he will find that children are not back to school full time yet. There are very few countries in the world that have completely normal school education operating. Even, I was reading a piece yesterday about Korea, where the test and trace capacity they've got is lauded as being one of the best in the world. They still have children only in school part-time. Now, I don't say that because that's my objective or because I want that. I say that to underline that all countries everywhere are grappling with the issues that we are grappling with. And the approach that we have decided we have to have in place as a contingency of blended learning is exactly what the UK government is doing for England. It's exactly what the Welsh government is doing for Wales. These are not straightforward issues. But in that first strand of if we have to have a blended model of education for a period, and I would hope that would be as short as possible period, then yes, I absolutely give the commitments that if that involves additional resources to maximise school time, the government will step in to do that, although we expect, as I would think everybody does, councils to be creative and innovative in how they use the resources they have. We will look at additional teaching capacity, whether that's from retired teachers or other sources that we can get that from. And we will scrutinise, that's what the Deputy First Minister is doing, Her Majesty's Inspector of Education will be scrutinising these plans as well, to make sure that if we have to have, for any period of time, for safety reasons, a model of education that is less than full-time, we absolutely maximise it and, of course, take steps to provide additional support to parents and young people for the periods they spend out of school. So these are difficult issues. Every issue we are dealing with right now in tackling this virus is complex. None of them are straightforward. We have to have safety at the heart of everything we do, but we will also bring to bear the creative thinking and solutions that, yes, was done in hospitals. But again, my last point, Presiding Officer, because you're looking at me impatiently, understandably, but my last point is for people making simplistic comparisons with what we did in the health service. Yes, we created the NHS Louisa Jordan, but anybody who thinks that there hasn't also been unavoidable significant disruption in the health service in dealing with this crisis, again, isn't looking closely enough at the issues. These are not ideal circumstances for any of us, but we will continue to navigate the country through them as best we can with the interests of everybody very much at our heart.
Jackson Carlaw.
First Minister, the country is looking at you impatiently and, to use your word, understandably. Soft words matched by a record of non-delivery, months of dithering on education. Presiding Officer, Matthew Eastwood, a parent of 2 young children in Edinburgh, has put it better than any of us can. Writing to MSPs this week, he said, whilst careers may be furloughed, childhood cannot. And I agree, we must not put a price tag on our children's future. So far, what we've seen are half measures, buck passing, and parents are rightly furious. So I'm going to ask the First Minister for a commitment today. Will she promise to commit the funds that are required, whatever it takes, to underpin a national endeavour to help councils get schools back in place and give this generation of children the start in life they deserve?
First Minister.
If Jackson Carlaw was remotely interested in my answers or the substance, he would have heard me give that commitment in my previous answer. I don't put a price tag on the education of children, but equally, I will not act recklessly to put the lives of children, teachers or the wider community at risk. And I will continue to work through these issues in the way that the public would expect me to do. What I won't do, and what we haven't had to do is cancel plans to bring schools back this month because we hadn't thought through and worked through the practicalities and the difficult issues the way the UK government had to do just last week. So we will continue to work through difficult issues. And what I'd say to Jackson Carlaw, I've been tested by this, and I will continue as First Minister to be enormously tested by this, and people will make their own judgments on how and if I rise to that. But I think opposition politicians are tested by this as well, and I think the approach that Jackson Carlaw is taking also perhaps reveals more about him and his party, character and ability, than it does about me. And I'm not sure that people looking at that right now will be seeing a particularly appealing picture.
Question 2, Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, 2 days ago, the Children and Young People's Commissioner for Scotland, Bruce Adamson, declared the state has an obligation to ensure that children can access their human right to education. He went on, this is an education emergency and resources must be moved by the Scottish Government if necessary. First Minister, he is right. We are in an education emergency and children do have a right to education. So we need to pull out all of the stops to make sure our children return to school safely and full time as soon as possible. So what additional resources are you going to give councils to make that happen?
First Minister.
Can I say, well, firstly, we are in a health emergency right now that has caused an economic emergency, and it has also created an education emergency, and we have to tackle all of them simultaneously, which is what the government is seeking to do. I agree with the Children and Young People's Commissioner. Young people do have a basic human right to education, but I also think children have a basic human right not to be put at risk of a deadly virus, and that is what we have to make sure we don't inadvertently do either. Thankfully, most of the evidence so far suggests that children may be less susceptible to this virus, but that evidence is not conclusive. This is a virus that we still know far too little about because it hasn't been around yet for long enough. We also know there has been a tiny minority of children so far, and hopefully it will stay like that, who suffer an inflammatory disease complication, or who may do so, Kawasaki disease. So we cannot play fast and loose with the safety of children, and I hope and I expect that no one across this chamber would argue that we ever should do that. We have already given councils significant additional resources, and we are working with councils right now to look at the plans they can put in place for blended learning, if that is what is required, and we will then scrutinise those plans, and if they have to go further, we will have a conversation with councils about the resources that are required. That is the proper way to go about these things, and we've also asked for the Inspectorate to have a role in scrutinising that as well. But that's one strand of work. The other strand of work is to look at whether we can get the virus levels low enough and then rely on test and protect and perhaps other hygiene measures in schools to allow a full-time return where children can operate normally. So these are all really important issues, but they are not simple, straightforward issues. No aspect of this virus is. And I'm just going to continue to get on with the hard work of trying to get through them and steer the best course through them, working with those that we need to work with, because that, frankly, is my responsibility as First Minister, and it's one that I'm going to continue to focus on.
Richard Leonard.
But it's also your responsibility to give local councils the resources they need to restart our education system. And Scotland's teachers, parents and young people also want clarity. And this week, they've had nothing but mixed messages. So anxious parents are writing to me about the impact that schools being closed is having on their children and the impact your mixed messages are having as well. One mum told me that, and I quote, "It's just adding more stress to an already stressful situation." And it's not just parents. A survey of head teachers and deputy head teachers by the EIS just last week found that over 90% needed, and I quote, "greater clarity over how the next academic year of teaching will be delivered." And instead of clarity, we've seen the First Minister contradict her deputy, contradict her advisers, then contradict herself. This is not clarity, it's chaos. First Minister, you produced a 4-phase route map for opening up the economy. Why can't you publish a detailed route map and a timetable for a return to full-time, face-to-face schooling? Will you provide the national leadership and the resources our councils need that gives parents, teachers and pupils the clarity they demand and deserve to get their lives back on track?
First Minister.
You see, Presiding Officer, on the day that we published the 4-phase route map for getting the whole country, not just the economy, out of lockdown, we also published the report of the Education Recovery Group that looked at that in terms of education. That was a plan that we are now working with councils to implement, that was agreed. It wasn't imposed by government, it was agreed through that group by government, by councils, by education trade unions and by parents' organisations. That is the plan we are now operationalising with councils in case we need that contingency for blended learning. And that's a similar approach that has been taken in other parts of the UK. And we will work with councils to make sure that the resources are there to maximise the time children spend in school if that approach is necessary. But as I say, we are also looking at whether it is safe to take another approach that gets children back into school normally. This is not about an unwillingness to make the resources available. This is about making sure we have an approach to schooling that keeps children safe as well as maximises the quality of their educational experience. And these, both of those objectives are vital as we move through this next phase. But if we want to get back to normality in education, in the economy, in all aspects of our life, then it necessitates a careful approach to coming out of lockdown. And what I'd say to everybody across this chamber is when I stand up here tomorrow and set out the next steps, then those who want normality in our schools, but also say we should go quicker on coming out of lockdown, will have a fundamental contradiction at the heart of their argument. So I ask people, and I mean this absolutely genuinely, let's work our way through this, but let's be consistent in the arguments we are making. Our first priority is to beat this virus so that we can bring the country back to normality safely. And anybody who argues simplistically that there's some kind of magic shortcut to that is not putting the interests of this country first.
Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, I'm not asking for a shortcut, I'm simply asking for a route map. And all the government has produced so far, is a starting point for blended learning. It's not a way back to full-time schooling. So children have already been failed by the government's response to their educational needs in this crisis. Indeed, as many as 62% of parents taking part in a question and answer session with the Education Secretary last night said that their children have had no access to online lessons while schools have been closed. The one additional resource the government promised was 25,000 laptops for those children who need them most for home learning. And 4 weeks on, still not one single device has been issued, not one. We've got one of the world's worst records on tackling COVID-19, so we should be making sure that we've got one of the world's best records on supporting our children coming out of it. Parents across Scotland are crying out for a clear plan to get their children back into the classroom. One parent told us there seems to be a lack of ambition and investment in overcoming the challenges. First Minister, at the start of this crisis, you rightly channelled resources into the NHS. The NHS Louisa Jordan was created and ready to take patients in 3 weeks. New equipment was brought into hospitals right across Scotland. So where is the commitment? Where is the energy? Where is the drive? Where is the conviction? Where is the national plan and the national leadership? Where is the ambition to tackle this schools crisis with the same urgency, to pull out all the stops, to make the resources available, to get our schools safely reopened and to uphold our children's right to an education?
First Minister.
The commitment is there. It's been repeated several times today, but I'm happy to do it again. But in reality, that involves putting in place the plans and doing the hard work to turn the ambition into reality, which is the process we are going through right now. And my commitment to parents and to young people is, as it has always been, to get normality back into education, as we want to get it into every aspect of our lives as quickly as possible, but as safely as possible. And I will not at any stage of this try to underplay or oversimplify complex issues that the entire world is trying to grapple its way through right now. And I absolutely recognise the stresses and the strains and the anxieties of parents right now, homeschooling while trying to juggle work commitments. And we will continue. I think we've got more to do to support parents for as long as a situation like that continues. But in point of fact, the Connect survey that was published on the 4th of June actually found an increasing proportion of parents, 68%, that said they did have the support they need for schoolwork. And we will continue to make the investments, whether that's through laptops or tablets that we're making available, or through the resourcing of the plans to get children back to school as quickly as possible. So, you know, I welcome and relish the debate around this. It is right and it's proper, but fundamentally, all of this involves hard graft, and that's the hard graft I and my colleagues in government, with our partners in local councils and with teachers and with others, are going to continue to do day in and day out.
Thank you. Question number 3, Patrick Harvey.
COVID crisis is clearly, of course, the most immediate challenge for the Scottish Government, but it must not allow us to fail on the deeper, longer-term crisis that we also face. And sadly, for the second year in a row, the Scottish Government announced yesterday it has missed its climate targets. It wasn't even a near miss. Emissions for 2018 actually went up instead of down. The Scottish Government never misses a chance to congratulate itself for setting world-leading targets, but it now needs to face up to the reality it has not been taking the steps necessary to meet those targets. Scotland can tackle the climate crisis and build a thriving renewable energy industry, developing the green jobs that we're going to need at the heart of our post-COVID economic recovery. But the STUC warned this week that the failure to support a Scottish renewable energy industry means those jobs will not materialise as turbines and other gear are just imported. Will the First Minister tell us when does she expect Scotland finally to start meeting its climate targets, and what will the government do to support the creation of jobs in the renewable energy industry in Scotland?
First Minister.
I expect us to meet our climate change targets on an ongoing and increasing basis. There will be fluctuations year on year in what is a long-term challenge, but actually the figures published this week, as well as the yearly increase that Patrick Harvey highlights, which is regrettable, but these will reflect different circumstances and different shifts in our energy mix reflecting those circumstances. What those figures also show is the long-term 50% reduction in our emissions, which actually gives us an incredibly strong foundation, probably one of the strongest in the world, now to move towards our 2045 ambition of net zero, with the very stretching targets along the way towards that. The investments that we already make in our economy, but particularly I think those as we will require to make to get our economy going again, reflected in some of what Kate Forbes said in the Chamber yesterday, it will open up additional opportunities to invest in the energy transition in that progress towards net zero. In terms of jobs in the renewables industry that come from some of the larger scale renewables projects, we work very hard to do that. We are using the powers we have at our disposal. Some of these powers still, and this is just a statement of fact, lie at Westminster around how contract for difference, for example, is structured, which doesn't yet fully allow us to maximise that potential. But we will continue to do everything we can to not just ensure that we're meeting our environmental targets, but that we are reaping the full economic benefit of that along the way.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It scarcely seems credible to say that the First Minister expects us to meet our targets on an ongoing basis when she knows that we're not. Throughout this Parliament, the First Minister has, I believe, genuinely wanted Scotland to be world-leading on this issue, but she has left her government with a track record where the best she can claim is being not quite as bad as Boris Johnson's government. Let's take transport in isolation. It's the area where we've seen the clearest long-term failure to reduce emissions. The Environment Secretary told Parliament yesterday that we shouldn't judge the government's track record on the basis of a single year's figures. But the truth is that this is a track record stretching back not just years but decades. Either the government hasn't been trying to reduce transport emissions, or it's been trying but pursuing the wrong policies. And just this week, the resumption of short-haul flights between Glasgow and London has been allowed when there is plenty of rail capacity that we should be using. Last year in Channel 4's climate debate, the First Minister said for the first time we need to fly less. OK, how much lower than the pre-COVID level of aviation does the First Minister think we should be aiming for? And what action will the government take to prevent aviation regrowth from breaching the safe, sustainable level?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, in terms of how we support people to fly less and to use alternatives, we continue, as we are doing, to invest in those alternatives and to make those alternatives more convenient and speedy for people. And I would hope that the work that is underway, the work that we will continue, but also this whole experience of going through the COVID crisis will help us to accelerate that as well. But can I say to Patrick Harvey, I'm not standing here far from it and saying that we don't have a monumental amount of work still to do. The entire world does. But Scotland, in terms of the reduction in our emissions so far, we are the second best country in the world, second only to Sweden. Now, what that says to me is actually what we have been doing has been working, but we need to do more of it and we need to do it more sustainably. So that's what we will continue to do, both in terms of the encouragements for behaviour change, but also the investments in alternative energy and in alternative ways of people travelling, heating their homes and living their lives. But to say that Scotland doesn't have both a very good track record and a very strong foundation, frankly, I think is way, way wide of the mark.
Question number 4, Willie Rennie.
The Scottish Government is opening up more of the economy. Thousands of parents will be returning to work in businesses and shops in June and July. But normal summer childcare, childminders, private nurseries, family and friends are still restricted by the government. And when schools open in August, children will be at home for up to 4 days a week. It doesn't add up. The First Minister is asking parents to go back to work, but who is going to look after the children? What are parents supposed to do?
First Minister.
So the first thing I'd say, not so much to people in the chamber, but to parents watching at home, is that none of this is easy for them. This is incredibly difficult. It has been difficult. And I wish, but can't wave a magic wand to make all of these difficulties disappear overnight. What we have to do is work to a plan to allow us to suppress the virus, keep the virus suppressed, and bring all aspects of life back to normal with as much alignment in that as we possibly can. But Willie Rennie's questions are legitimate and important. We have to bring the economy back carefully, and clearly the issues around economic challenges right now, I think understandably encourage people to think we should do that more quickly. We've got to continue to be cautious about that and do that according to the plan we set, and I'll set out the next steps in that tomorrow. But in terms of childcare, we want to see more key workers have access to the critical childcare hubs that we've had in place throughout the crisis, and have them running throughout the summer so that there is more access. It will not be possible for everyone, but so that there is more access. We published this week guidance for early learning and childcare so that we can begin the preparation to get early learning and childcare facilities back, and recognising that even some of the issues we are talking about with schools are even more difficult there. Particularly around physical distancing. But thirdly and lastly, what Willie Rennie described there in terms of schools coming back on the 11th of August is what we are working to try to change the reality of, so that we have children in school, even if it is under the contingency blended model for more than perhaps parents are looking at as a possibility right now, but also to get back to a normal week, schooling week as quickly as we can. So all of these bits of this complex jigsaw need to be in place, and we have to work methodically and very hard to get them in place as quickly, but I'll keep saying this, as safely as possible. Sometimes And I understand this. As we see the numbers that we report every day going downwards, there is a tendency to think, let's just get back to normal immediately. This virus is dangerous, it is potentially deadly, and it is still out there. And anybody who doubts that in Scotland just has to look at the fact we've still got people dying, but also look at what China are grappling with again, what some parts of America are still grappling with, which even some of the countries that are said to have done best in tackling it are still facing almost on a weekly basis. We have to do this properly, we have to do it right, and we have to do it with public health and safety at the forefront of our thinking.
Willie Rennie.
The First Minister knows I share her caution. I've been constructive throughout this pandemic. But yesterday, the Education Secretary said that if you criticised the policy, you were criticising the teachers. I think that's a shameful insult to thousands of parents with genuine concerns. And the problem is, for the First Minister, is that this is an issue that's coming up next week. People are going back to work next week. They need the support next week. The government have put parents in an impossible position. They cannot choose between their job and their children. The Scottish Government ramped up NHS capacity. It pumped billions of pounds into businesses to keep them alive. But on education, our children and their parents are being left behind. Why does the First Minister not accept that if she is asking parents to return to work, she has an obligation to work out who is going to care for their children?
Minister.
I do recognise that Willie Rennie's been constructive, and I do not criticise anybody for discussing these issues or for asking questions. All I ask, and it's up to people to decide whether they want to proceed on this basis, is for people, which I think Willie Rennie has generally done, recognise that these issues are not straightforward. And it's not the government that's putting parents in an impossible position. It's not any government that's doing that. It is a global health pandemic that is putting people in an impossible position that we have to try and mitigate and help them work their way through. And that's exactly what we will seek to do. We have to do that cautiously, because we cannot allow the virus to run away with us again and get a grip again, but we have to do it methodically as well and try to keep these pieces in line as far as possible. And that's what we will seek to do. I will not say to any parent or teacher or anybody else across the country anything other than this is incredibly difficult for them each and every single day. What I would say to Willie Rennie is I don't think it's correct to characterise it as something that's coming up next week. This is something parents and others have been living with right throughout this crisis because of the reality of the situation we're dealing with. And this is not about, as I said earlier on, it's not about an unwillingness to make resources available. It's about using resources properly to get the country, including schools, back to normal in a way that is sensible and doesn't put the health of children or others at risk. And that's what we will continue to prioritise.
Thank you. I know there's a lot of interest in asking supplementary questions at various stages. Just to remind members, I'll take all the supplementaries after question 7, after Monica Lennon's question. Move on now to question 5, Alistair Allen.
To ask the First Minister to provide an update for island residents who wish to book future ferry tickets.
First Minister.
We're working with ferry operators to identify measures to ensure passenger and crew safety when travelling, while observing 2 metres distancing on the vessels. Capacity will be obviously reduced by these measures, but we are putting in place to manage this. That includes considering how the booking systems of both CalMac and Serco Northlink might be used to help manage demand. Further details will be available in the Transport Transition Plan and from the operators as we move through the different phases of easing lockdown.
Alistair Allen.
I thank the First Minister for her response. As she is aware, islanders have in many cases not seen their family members on the mainland since March. They have strongly supported, however, these travel restrictions and are now anxious to know that whatever point it is considered safe to change the present travel advice about ferries, islanders have some kind of opportunity to book what will be a very limited supply of ferry tickets, perhaps on some priority basis. Is the government able to take steps to avoid any situation where new pressures on reduced services and capacity mean islanders don't get to see families until after any tourist season is over?
First Minister.
Well, I fully understand how important it is that islanders are able to access lifeline ferry services on which, of course, they depend on to get to and from the mainland, particularly to see their families. And they will rightly want to enjoy the same freedoms that others will be able to start enjoying as we ease out of lockdown. That, of course, like all aspects of this, requires careful consideration to make sure that people can move safely and without risk to themselves and others. There are practical considerations about how to do that safely, which means that capacity will be reduced by the measures that have to be put in place, but that must be managed to ensure that islanders are not disadvantaged, and that is a key consideration. I know that CalMac, Transport Scotland and Paul Wheelhouse, the Islands Minister, are all looking at this currently, and crucially there is and will continue to be ongoing engagement with island communities to determine the best way forward, and the involvement of people who actually live in our islands, like Alistair and his constituents, is absolutely key to that.
Question number 6, Brian Whittle.
Presiding Officer, to ask the First Minister what consideration the Scottish Government has given to the impact of lockdown restrictions on people with dementia.
First Minister.
Our route map recognises that the disruption to normal routines and connections and the physical constraints of staying indoors can and does have a profound impact on someone with dementia, which can lead to feelings of loneliness, lethargy, stress, anxiety or depression. That is why in Phase 1 we are already planning and implementing the safe gradual resumption of much needed access to respite and daycare to support unpaid carers and families. Changes to the care home sector on restricted visiting and a pause on normal activities and routines to protect residents, staff and visitors have had a significant impact on the well-being of residents and also their loved ones. We already, of course, enable families to visit loved ones in their final days and in other exceptional circumstances, but we're also developing plans for a phased return to visiting when it is clinically safe to do so.
Brian Whittle.
Can I thank the First Minister for that answer? My question was prompted by a friend of mine who called me on Monday to say that he had sadly lost his mother a couple of months ago. But it's compounded by the fact that his father is in a care home and suffering from dementia and has yet to be told that his wife had died, and they want to be able to tell him face to face. And as my friend has said, he's not just as saddened by the loss of his mother, but it's compounded by the fact that he feels that the dementia is accelerating because of the lack of contact with his family. So can I ask the First Minister, when she makes a statement tomorrow, will she consider giving clear guidance to care homes and families on visiting these care homes to ensure that this situation is rectified? Thank you.
Yes, we will consider the issue of guidance and how that guidance develops at every stage of the route map. But can I say to Brian Whittle, as I said in my earlier answer, visiting is permitted in end-of-life situations, but also in other exceptional circumstances. It may well be that the very distressing circumstances that he's recounted, it's entirely up to him and to his constituent, but if he wants to pass those details, we could look into whether or not visiting in those circumstances would be possible now, even without further developments of that. This is one of many really difficult aspects of dealing with this crisis. People who have been most at risk, people in care homes, are also people who have had to live under some of the most distressing restrictions and not have access to family visits as normal. Like so much else, we want to see a return to normality as quickly as possible, but given what we have already seen unfold in our care homes, I think everybody will understand that we are perhaps even more cautious here than in other areas. So there is work underway and a lot of thinking going into when and the way in which normal visiting can be resumed in care homes, but it is a decision that has to be based on the most careful consideration and thought. But on the specific case, I and the Health Secretary would be very happy to look into that in particular if that is helpful.
Question number 7, Monica Lennon.
Thank you. To ask the First Minister whether she will provide an update on the Scottish Government's plans to restart NHS services in light of reported concerns from patients experiencing delays to their treatment.
First Minister.
We recently published the framework for remobilising the health service. The framework sets out how health boards will follow national and local clinical advice to safely and gradually prioritise the resumption of some pause services over the coming weeks and beyond, as well as retaining sufficient capacity for COVID-19. Boards have continued to protect key services throughout the pandemic and are now gradually restarting services across key specialties such as cardiology, urology, trauma and orthopaedics, as well as endoscopies and other diagnostic services. Patients will be seen on the basis of clinical need, and I would encourage anyone who has been offered an outpatient or a diagnostics appointment or a date for surgery to attend to ensure that they receive the treatment and care they require. That said, we know that coronavirus may well be with us for some time to come, and so we will have to continue to balance the restarting of services against the need to keep the virus under control, to continue to protect the NHS and to ensure that there is capacity to deal with any cases of the virus who need hospital or intensive care treatment.
Monica Lennon.
I thank the First Minister for her response, and I think we're all acutely aware of the need to manage the direct risks of COVID-19 as well as the harms caused by lockdown itself. My constituent, Geoffrey Hills, fears he will lose his sight as a result of lockdown because of delays to his cataract operation. This is an outcome that clearly must be avoided and could be avoided if testing and PPE, if they're both utilised to support COVID-free zones and a safe resumption of NHS services. And like Mr Hills, there are thousands of patients across Scotland waiting for treatment, including cancer patients and people living with chronic pain who've been telling Parliament how difficult that is for them. First Minister, I think all MSPs have been meeting in recent weeks with health boards and us the importance to help them to manage public expectations. But clearly the framework doesn't have any dates attached to it. So how can we help our constituents to give them a bit of hope and confidence, but how can we manage public expectations and what further clarity can we expect?
First Minister.
Well, the resumption of services within the constraints that I've already outlined today will be an ongoing process, and we want that to happen as quickly as possible. Some of it is already happening in the specialties that I spoke about. We do have COVID-free zones in hospitals. There is a proper and appropriate supply of PPE, and staff have clear guidance about the use of PPE. We are continuing to look, advised by our nosocomial advisory group, on the use of testing or the further use of regular testing in hospitals to assist with this process of reopening the health service. We will look and are looking, as I said, I think in response to a question last week, at all of the resources, particularly around elective treatments, and cataracts would fall into that category of resources, including the NHS Louisa Jordan. So this is something that will be ongoing. It will be accelerated as quickly and to the extent that it is possible to do so within the constraints that I have outlined. The issue with dates is always going to be one of the most difficult things in dealing with this virus. Hopefully it becomes easier as the weeks go on, but it is the uncertainties of the virus itself. None of us, unfortunately, have a crystal ball about exactly how it will unfold, and that means we have to assess the data and the evidence to know what is safe to do at the particular points we're making these decisions. But I would, just as I would say to parents and to others who have been living for 3 months with the difficulties of this, I would certainly extend that to patients waiting for treatment. We want to get you back with a normally functioning health service as quickly as possible. But like everything else, it has to be done with that imperative of safety absolutely at the forefront of our minds.
Thank you. We'll take a number of supplementary questions now. Linda Fabiani to be followed by Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister is aware that my constituency of East Kilbride has already suffered a huge blow from the UK Government decision to move thousands of skilled HMRC jobs from the town. Can I ask that the First Minister now presses the UK Prime Minister for a guarantee that 600 jobs covering vital international development work free from political interference, remain at Abercrombie House in East Kilbride?
First Minister.
Yes, we will continue Prime Minister said yesterday that none of the jobs were at risk, and I welcome that, and I think it is incumbent on all of us to hold the UK Government to that commitment on behalf of the hundreds of people who work in East Kilbride. But can I say more generally, I fundamentally disagree with the decision that was announced yesterday to merge the Foreign and Commonwealth Office with DFID in this way, because I think it puts foreign policy, I think it puts commercial and political ambition ahead of the needs of the world's poorest and most vulnerable communities at a time of global crisis. And that's why I think it is a regrettable move in the context in which it was made.
Miles Briggs, be followed by Rhoda Grant.
First Minister, the Edinburgh Evening News reports today on the case of my constituent, Mr Roger Lane, who was transferred from the Midlothian Community Hospital to a care home against the wishes of his family, with his power of attorney being overruled. Mr Lane developed and died from coronavirus on May the 27th. Mr Lane's daughter, Gail, has said, "I will never be able to forgive them for my dad. Someone needs to be held accountable." First Minister, we know that 1,090 additional care home places were purchased and patients moved as part of Minister's COVID-19 response. Now, I have raised my concerns regarding the human rights of patients with the First Minister previously, but what investigation has the First Minister undertaken into these patients and how these families have been treated during this coronavirus outbreak?
First Minister.
I've made clear that there will be full inquiry, investigation, exploration of all aspects of this crisis, including the decision-making and the impact on our care homes, and I think that's really important generally. I've said before, issues around discharge are taken carefully. They are taken on the basis of clinical risk assessments. I recall at the start of March, at the outset of this crisis, some in this chamber were asking us why there weren't more people being discharged from hospital who were delayed in hospital. But it's really important that we assess all of this in order that we have accountability, but also learn lessons for the future. On the particular case, which sounds to me from what Miles Briggs has said, is that it should not have happened in the way it did. Discharge planning should involve families, clinicians, and where possible, the person who has been discharged. And again, I'd be very happy to look into the particulars of that case to see whether there are answers we can get for the family, but also whether there are lessons that require to be learned in that particular case.
Rhoda Grant, to be followed by Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A constituent contacted me about a neighbour who received a self-testing kit for COVID-19. They did the test, but there was nobody available to pick up the test. The neighbour contacted me and I spoke to NHS Highland. The test was uplifted 3 days later. Now, I'm not a scientist, but I figure that test would have been basically useless by that time. Can I ask the First Minister what steps she's going to take to make sure that everybody, regardless of where they live, has an access to testing, and indeed testing that can give a result?
First Minister.
Again, obviously I can't comment on the individual case without knowing the details, but the speed of testing here is of huge importance, and as we go forward in Test and Protect, one of the things that we will want to report on is the turnaround time for tests. We have, when we launched Test and Protect, we said, and this is work that is ongoing, we'll be taking steps to improve beyond the situation that exists now, improve the local accessibility, which is particularly important in our rural areas. But we also, while home testing, I think does and may have a growing part to play, I've always been very sceptical about placing too much reliance on tests that are effectively posted to people and either require people to send them back or them to be picked up. I think testing that is actually done there and then with somebody who can do the test is better. So we will continue to strengthen the resilience and reliability of Test and Protect as we go forward in all of these different aspects. But in terms of the 3-day wait for a test to be picked up, obviously I'd be happy to look into that if I had further details of the particular circumstances.
Thank you. Claire Adamson, to be followed by Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government is doing to ensure that families have support to access food over the summer holidays?
First Minister.
We announced yesterday continuation of free school meal entitlement over the summer and made clear that we were giving councils additional money, £12.6 million, to pay for that extended provision. And I think that's really important at a time when we know lots of families who probably were already struggling to make ends meet are finding things even harder right now. Many councils will be integrating that free school meal provision with their wider food support, so we have also made additional funding available to councils to help them with that wider provision as well. Food poverty, food insecurity is something that should always shame a country as rich as ours, and we have to deal with it at source as far as we can. But while there are people living in food poverty, we all have a duty, and we take this very seriously in the Scottish Government, to do everything we can to help people get the food that absolutely is a basic human right.
Maurice Corrie, to be followed by Neil Bibby.
Presiding Officer, bearing in mind the current emergency and its devastating effects on education in Scotland, can the First Minister give me concrete assurance that the Scottish Government has provided local authorities in my West Scotland region with sufficient additional financial resources to ensure that the careers, guidance and advisory support services in our schools will provide the most effective and the very best support to our school leavers this term and for next year?
First Minister.
We'll continue to work with local authorities to make sure that they have the resources they need to get through this crisis, and we will do that on not just education but in all aspects of the challenges we're facing. I've just talked about money we announced yesterday, additional to local authorities. We've provided local authorities with substantial additional resources so far, and those conversations will continue.
Neil Bibby, to be followed by John Mason. Neil Bibby.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. 2 weeks ago, I asked the First Minister to establish an aerospace and aviation task force, and I am grateful that a group has been established to respond to the situation at Rolls-Royce and support aerospace jobs. However, with the loss of 160 Menzies aviation jobs at Glasgow Airport being announced and NCP workers also facing redundancy, will the First Minister agree that we also need a focus on aviation and specifically on what can be done to support our airports? Glasgow Airport is one of the biggest employers in my region, and both Unite and the GMB trade unions are warning further job losses are to come. They support the creation of an airport jobs task force. Will the Scottish Government?
First Minister.
Look, I will consider any suggestions. As Neil Bibby said, he made a suggestion for a cross-party task force to specifically at aerospace in light of the Rolls-Royce announcement, and we have taken that forward. I would say I think we have to guard against a plethora of different task forces, because I think we need to see this as an overall challenge and perhaps look at these things in a more joined-up sectoral way. We will have early next week the report and recommendations from the Economic Recovery Action Group that's been chaired by Benny Higgins, and I think we will reflect further in light of that. But there is a real commitment here at every level and in every way to do all that we can to support the economy as it recovers from this unprecedented challenge that it faces. In addition, on aerospace, in addition to the cross-party approach that we've already referred to today, I spoke directly to the Chief Executive of Rolls-Royce a week or so ago, and there is also work ongoing between the Government and Rolls-Royce to look both in the short and medium and long term what we can do working together to preserve jobs and hopefully a footprint for Rolls-Royce in Scotland. So these are all really important challenges for us, and I think we have to find the best way of making sure that we catalyse the whole Parliament in a Team Scotland approach. Whether that is lots of different task forces or more joined up strategic task forces, I think is a discussion we need to have. But the willingness to involve other voices across the chamber in that is certainly there and very clear.
John Mason, to be followed by Mike Rumbles.
Thank you very much. To ask the First Minister if she's had any discussions with the UK Government about extending the job retention scheme.
First Minister.
We're having ongoing discussions with the UK Government about the retention of the job retention scheme, the extension of the job retention scheme, whether that is should be on a general basis or as targeted to specific sectors that will have challenges for longer. And obviously, I'm thinking there not exclusively, but perhaps particularly about the tourism sector. I think it is essential, and I think the evidence is growing. I see some evidence published this morning about the numbers of companies that are expressing concern about the impact of a premature ending of the job retention scheme. So other countries, and other countries rightly, their example is used to encourage the Scottish Government to do more, which I think is right and proper, but other countries, France in particular, have already taken steps that I think the UK Government should follow, which is announcing extension to that kind of scheme for a period of up to 2 years. So we will continue to have hopefully constructive discussions around that as jointly we support the economy through the difficult times that still lie ahead.
Mike Rumbles, to be followed by Joe McAlpine.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. 3 metres is better for social distancing than 2 metres. And 2 metres is better than 1 metre. But the World Health Organization says that 1 metre is safe. Will the First Minister aim to change social distancing to 1 metre, as recommended by the World Health Organization, because the present level will risk both lives and livelihoods if there isn't a plan to move to 1 metre at some point as we move towards coming out of lockdown?
First Minister.
I think we've got to be careful here that we don't mischaracterise what the WHO is saying. The WHO says a minimum of 1 metre, but it's also very clear that there is a continuum of risk, and there's often other factors that have to be taken account of. So I think that if we get agreement on that, that's a useful starting point. I don't have any particular fixation on a particular distance. I just want to keep people safe, and I want to do that in a way that is as conducive as possible to getting the economy moving again. What I will always resist is the tendency to try to see any of these things in isolation, because they are not. And so we have to be very careful about this. I come back to the point that the advice I have right now is that we should not move away from 2 metres right now. And for all of the talk around this, not one of the governments in the UK has decided to move away from 2 metres right now. But yes, there is a consideration, an ongoing consideration of are there circumstances, are there particular settings, and are there particular mitigations you could bring to bear that would make something like that possible. And I am not close-minded to that, but I will not be pushed into doing it in a way that looks at that issue in isolation or does it in a way that is unsafe. And one of the hard parts at the heart of this is that some of the settings, the economic locations that I understand feel they would benefit most practically and economically from this are also some of the locations that the evidence are telling us are more high-risk transmission areas, the so-called super spreader areas. So this is, like all of these things, it's a kind of common refrain of mine. None of these things are simple, none of them are straightforward, none of them are binary. It would be much easier if they were. But we have to come to the right judgments, the balanced judgments, taking account of all of the risks and benefits along the way. And I will continue to try to do that on all aspects, because I come back to this point, my fundamental duty right now is to do everything I can to get the country through this crisis as safely as possible, and I will not be diverted from that.
June McAlpine to be followed by Murdo Fraser.
Thank you. Many experts have warned that a second spike in coronavirus will be doubly disastrous if combined with a no-deal or a low-deal Brexit. Can I therefore ask the First Minister to update Parliament on what further representations have been made to the Westminster Government over an extension to the Brexit transition period?
First Minister.
Well, both ourselves and indeed the Welsh Government, as recently as last week, made a plea to the UK Government to seek an extension to the Brexit transition period so that we take away any prospect of either a no-deal Brexit or, as Joe McAlpine rightly says, some kind of low-scale deal that puts jobs and livelihoods at risk. Unfortunately, that appears to so far have been ignored, but we will keep making that case, even although time is running out for common sense to prevail here. My views on Brexit are well known. I'm not going to rehearse all of that. I think Brexit is a bad idea. I think a no-deal Brexit is a catastrophic idea. And I think in the best of times, anybody who contemplated that really has serious questions to answer. But to contemplate that in the teeth of the crisis that we are confronted with because of COVID is just unthinkable and I think deplorable. And I think the UK Government will have very serious questions to answer for a very long time to come if they allow it to happen.
Murdo Fraser to be followed by Alec Rowley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I have 2 children who are Scouts, and many members here will have family connections or local associations with the Scouting movement. Today, Scouts Scotland have said that 47% of their staff are now at risk of redundancy, including at the Fordell Firs Outdoor Centre in Fife, due to a projected loss of income this year of £1.5 million. And Scouts Scotland has had no funding from the Third Sector Resilience Fund. So can I ask, what support can the Scottish Government offer to organisations like Scouts Scotland to do so much excellent work with our young people? And will the criteria for the Third Sector Resilience Fund now be widened so that charities like Scouts Scotland can apply?
First Minister.
I think the Scouts do a fantastic job, and I would pay tribute to them for that. We will, right throughout this, try to be as expansive as we possibly can within the obvious limitations of resources that we face to help as many organisations and individuals and interests as possible. I think the Finance Secretary has already demonstrated in the amendments and changes that have been made along the way a willingness to do that. I cannot stand here and say that we can flex any scheme to take account of and cater for absolutely everyone. I wish I could, but I can't do that. But we will continue to try to do as much as we can to accommodate organisations that do great work and are seriously challenged by this. But of course, the main thing we can do for the Scouts and for everybody else is to safely get us back to normal. And that comes back to this key point that we have to continue, as we are doing right now, to suppress this virus. Because if we get it suppressed to the point that we can keep it suppressed through test and protect and hopefully get agreements to deal with the potential of it coming into the country from elsewhere, then we can all move back to much greater normality than we might have thought possible just a month or two ago. So that's the big challenge right now, but it's also the prize for continued patience at this, understandably, very frustrating phase for everybody.
Alec Rowley to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Presiding Officer, last week Professor Jim Gallagher told the Finance and Constitution Committee that, and I quote, adding further economic disruption on top of the economic disruption caused by the COVID crisis by driving towards a hard Brexit in the hope that it will somehow be disguised by the COVID crisis would not be just unwise, it would be wicked. Can I ask the First Minister, given what she's already said on this, and given that it looks like that's where the Westminster Government is heading, can I ask her what progress has been made by the Scottish Government in terms of preparing to try and offset the worst impacts of this likely outcome on businesses, on jobs and on the Scottish economy?
First Minister.
Well, it's a good question, and it's one that we are having to address. Let me say, we shouldn't be having to address this right now because all of our efforts and energy should be focused on trying to deal with the COVID crisis and our recovery from that. And it's inexplicable to me why any government would seek to heap more economic pain on top of the economic pain that we are already facing. But we are having to restart our no-deal Brexit planning. So in the next couple of weeks, the immediate date escapes me right now, the Cabinet will have to spend time looking at those plans again. Mike Russell's leading that work. But every minute, every hour, every day, right now, the government are having to spend on looking at how we mitigate the impact of Brexit, and particularly a no or a bad deal Brexit is a minute, day, hour we're not spending on focusing on the COVID crisis. So I would appeal again to the UK government to not allow this madness to happen. Let's all of us focus on getting the country through the immediate health crisis and then supporting the country to recover from the economic crisis that we're facing without compounding that with the lunacy of Brexit.
Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, each of our islands is unique. What criteria will be used and who will decide when and how our islands come out of lockdown? Whilst community engagement has been discussed, how will that work in tandem with the Scottish Government, ferry companies and relevant local authority? And with a reduced ferry service and hugely diminished capacity due to social distancing, what additional support will be provided to island businesses given the huge fall in visitor numbers at the height of the summer tourist season?
First Minister.
Well, on the latter part of the question, the initiatives that we are announcing and the further initiatives that we will undoubtedly put in place to help business will obviously have a particular consideration of island and rural businesses given the particular challenges that they are facing, and that will be true of the initiative Kate Forbes announced yesterday, as it will be of future initiatives. On the issues about coming out of lockdown, and I want the whole country now to come out of lockdown safely over the period ahead. We will, as we sort of go forward, and the surveillance systems that we are putting in place to make sure that we can continue to track COVID and be aware of any localised clusters or spikes, That will involve making data available to local authorities, making data available to the public so that they can take informed judgments about risks that they might be taking, but it will also involve discussions between national and local government about localised decisions that may fall to be taken, and we're already discussing with COSLA and local authorities how that will work in practice. But in terms of coming out of lockdown, the more we suppress this virus now, the sooner and more sustainably the whole country can emerge from what we have been living through. And Jamie Halker-Johnson.
The Economy Secretary announced in April the creation of a £45 million ferry fund to support operators throughout the current COVID crisis. While vital independent operators have received some support through other funding streams, that has been considerably less than the amount suggested by the Economy Secretary's funding announcement. And some independent firms, like Pentland Ferries, have received indicators that they will not be eligible for support from this fund at all. So can the First Minister answer why, when independent and subsidised operators are facing similar challenges and are equally vital to our communities they serve, independent operators have been treated so differently by this Scottish Government?
First Minister. Well, it's important with any fund like this that there is fairness and transparency about how funds are allocated. And as I think I said some weeks back in an exchange in the Chamber, at times of crisis where we've put funds in place very, very quickly, some of the normal due diligence has been done much more quickly. But that principle of fairness and transparency is absolutely still got to be there. I don't have the details in front of me of the breakdown of the support for ferries. I'm happy to have a look at that. There is certainly will have been no intention to unfairly treat particular operators, but the rules of how the money is being allocated, if that inadvertently has done that, then of course, as with all of these things, we will be happy to look at it and see if there are better arrangements that can be put in place in future.
Thank you very much. And on that note, we're going to end First Minister's questions. We resume at 2:30 with a ministerial statement. Parliament is suspended.